And Donald Trump should be here to answer for that, but he's not. And I want to look at that camera right now and tell you, Donald, I know you're watching. You can't help yourself. I know you're watching, okay? And you're not here tonight, not because of polls and not because of your indictments. You're not here tonight because you're afraid of being on the stage and defending your record. You're ducking these things. And let me tell you what's going to happen. You keep doing that, no one up here is going to call you Donald Trump anymore. We're going to call you Donald Duck.
Where's Joe Biden? He's completely missing in action from leadership. And you know who else is missing in action? Donald Trump is missing in action. He should be on this stage tonight. He owes it to you to defend his record, where they added $7.8 trillion to the debt.
Some of us aren't paid to. Excuse me. Thank you for speaking while I'm interrupting. While I'm speaking.
You said
if I may finish.
You can't be on both sides.
Gentlemen, you'll have your turn.
A possible make or break night for Republican presidential candidates looking to slow former President Donald Trump's momentum. I'm Mychael Schnell. Welcome to the Hill's 2024 Debate Breakdown. Our coverage of the second Republican presidential debate starts right now. Seven candidates hit the stage at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library with a singular goal tonight: show the American people why they're better suited for the job than frontrunner Donald Trump. The debate was contentious and heated at times, but did anyone have a breakout performance? Let's dive right into the conversation. Joining us now is Democratic strategist and founding partner of Northern Star Strategies, Mychael Starr Hopkins, and Sarah Chamberlain. She's the president and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership and founder of the Women to Women Conversations Tour. Sarah, Mychael, thank you both for joining us. I'm excited to dive into it. As I said, there was a lot of heated conversation there. There was some talk about policy. We're going to get into all the specifics, but Sarah, I'll start with you. Who do you think won the debate tonight and why?
I actually think Donald Trump won it. I mean, it's hard to touch him. Other than that, I think that Vivek did a very good job. I think that he showed that he is a front leader because everybody on the stage attacked him numerous times. So I think of this group, he will come out tomorrow as the winner of the debate.
Mychael, who do you think won and why?
So I actually think Nikki Haley had the best debate. She was consistent from the first debate, where I think she had a pretty good performance. And she's kind of playing the role that Chris Christie played in 2018, where he was kind of the assassin on stage. And he took people off to build up that strength. He just couldn't finish the job. I think here you're seeing Haley really look forward to the fight, because Donald Trump is a fighter at the end of the day. And so going toe-to-toe with other candidates is only going to prepare her and make her stronger.
So we talk about the winners from the debate, but of course, former President Trump is the front runner in this current Republican primary. He's topped every poll out there. So the key question is even if they won the debate tonight, is it enough to chip away at former President Trump's lead? And Sarah, I want to go to you. I know you said Trump was a winner. I mean, he was mentioned a ton of times in this debate, but you also mentioned Vivek Ramaswamy, who took a lot of incoming and he dished it back to some others. Do you think his performance was enough to chip away at Trump's lead and potentially see a bump in the polls in the weeks to come?
I think it was enough to see a small bump, but I think what he's playing for is kind of the front leader if something happens to Trump with his criminal indictments. So I think this is a race for who's going to be second if Trump falls. I think he did a nice job. I think Vivek is the future of the Republican Party, whether it's this cycle or the cycle to come.
And Mychael, you mentioned Nikki Haley as the winner. A lot of folks said that she came out the strongest after the first debate, and she did see a bump in the polls. But still, former President Trump is high up there. He has double-digit leads in a lot of these polls. Do you think that Nikki Haley will continue to rise, and do you think it'll get her within any distance of former President Trump?
I think the big problem for Nikki Haley is Donald Trump actually won't go to trial until people have started voting. And so all these candidates kind of want to be the alternative. Well, people are going to have to make their choice before they get to the alternative. Nikki Haley is somebody I think Democrats should be wary of, but I think the person who Democrats are more wary of is actually Tim Scott, because he has a higher ceiling.
And I want to go back to Vivek Ramaswamy quickly, because he even mentioned on the debate stage that he's one of the newer faces within the Republican Party. Right now, he's trying to earn the trust of voters, introduce himself. He took a lot of incoming, and he had a really interesting line right here that I think is going to get a lot of coverage post-debate. We're going to show that right now quickly.
Be very clear about this. Transgenderism, especially in kids, is a mental health disorder. We have to acknowledge the truth of that for what it is. It is not compassionate to affirm a kid's confusion. That is not compassion, that is cruelty.
I mean, what do you make of this? Sarah, we'll go to you. You mentioned Vivek at the top, and you say he's the future. This is something that, we see this conversation about wokeism, about transgenderism within the Republican Party. This seemed to take it up a notch. I'm curious how you think it'll play within the party.
It did take it up a notch, but it's the polling shows that Republican Main Street Partnership is doing, especially with our women to women. They like his comment. They don't want the children under 18 being able to have all these surgeries and all of this. So his comments actually match the polling that we've been doing. So I think he did a nice job. It is a mental health problem, and we need to address it as such.
And then, Mychael, I want to get you in here. You mentioned Tim Scott at the tail end of your answer beforehand. He was sort of in the background a bit at the first debate, but he had some more speaking time. This time, he landed a couple blows. He got into a couple really notable back and forths with Nikki Haley. Do you think that he'll have any sort of breakout after tonight? And talk a little bit more what you mean by he's the one that Republicans should fear the most.
Well, Nikki Haley's more of a known commodity. Tim Scott, we don't really know a lot about his background. He hasn't been nationally introduced. And I think the comment that he made today about the Johnson administration and slavery not being as tough as it was during the Johnson administration, that's going to play really well in right-wing media. I think the Fox and Friends crowd that is very unapologetic or wants to push slavery and the Civil War off to the side, they're really going to feel good about that comment. And so I think much like Herschel Walker played well in Georgia, I think Tim Scott will play well nationally.
Now, those are the top lines from tonight's debate. But of course, the one notable aspect of tonight's debate was that the frontrunner, former President Trump, was not on the stage. And we have a poll that was just released by News Nation and Decision Desk HQ, which shows that former President Trump's unfavorability topped 55% among registered voters. This news comes a day after a federal judge in New York ruled that Trump and his organization committed fraud to build his real estate empire. Earlier on Wednesday, Mr. Trump met with striking auto workers in Michigan. President Biden was there on Tuesday. Trump delivered a primetime speech in front of non-union auto parts supply workers near Detroit. We'll show some of that.
The only time Joe Biden has ever gotten his hands dirty is when he's taking cash from foreign countries, which is quite often. It's quite often. Based on what we're seeing, it's much more often than anyone would have thought. Can you imagine an unannounced raid on his many homes? He would have made Senator Menendez look like a baby. Just like a baby. You have an opponent and you say, let's indict him. And because people know me so well, we know each other very well, my ratings and my approval numbers went up. I'm the only person who ever got indicted when my numbers went up. It's so weird.
I mean, Sarah, is this strategy working for former President Trump? Will it continue to work for him if it is? This was the second primary debate. Of course, he didn't attend. He had his own counter-programming, that rally in Michigan. He still partially dominated the debate stage. You saw him talking a lot, being spoken a lot about on the stage. How do you think this strategy will work for him?
Actually, I think it works very well for him. He's out there. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, the base of the Republican Party is still behind him. It doesn't matter how many times he gets indicted. He's strong in the base. So for him not showing up on the stage, they can talk about him, as we talked about earlier, but they can't really attack him because he's not there. And he doesn't have to respond to these attacks. And I think it's a good strategy. He's up 40 points over most of the people on the stage. So why go? If I was advising him, I would tell him not to go to these debates either.
Mychael, would you agree with that? I mean, he is the front runner, and I guess you can make the argument that he has nothing to gain from being on this debate stage. But traditionally, the great part about a debate is that you can see all candidates, all side by side, hashing it out.
Yeah, I mean, the 7 people we saw on that debate stage were a total joke at the end of the day. I would imagine something like 90% of Americans didn't even know there was a debate. And probably 95% of Americans couldn't even name the 7 people who were debating tonight. Trump's going to be the nominee, and that's going to be a big problem for Republicans because the base is going to support Trump, but independents aren't. And the more we talk about abortion, the more Trump gets indicted, the more he gets on stage and opens his mouth. He's not just creating a record for voters, but he's creating a record for prosecutors. And we saw when he did his interview with Caitlin from CNN, he literally got himself indicted by the comments he made. So if I was him, I would do as little debates as possible.
Sarah, you mentioned before that, we've seen poll after poll that even after these indictments, Trump's support is not dwindling. In fact, it's only growing. We've seen that in the numbers. And even, after the decision by the New York judge this week, I would ask, do you think that that trend will continue? Do you still think that he will gain this support despite these increased legal troubles? And then I also want to ask you, going back to that poll, the News Nation Decision Desk poll found that roughly 44% see Trump as very unfavorable. What do you think his campaign can do to turn this around?
Well, I think the people who find him unfavorable, I don't think there's anything Trump can do. I think it's going to come down to, okay, we don't like Trump, but Biden is an old man who may or may not be a bit senile. So what do we do? It's going to be a really tough choice. For Trump's base, I don't think it matters how many times he gets indicted and what happens in the legal system. They are with him. They have been with him since day one. They are sticking with him. I mean, he made the comment a couple years ago he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose his base. I think he could be right about that. They love him, and it's a new politics. You've never really seen this in the history of our country. It's someone who is just commands the primary electorate to the extent that he does. It's really fascinating to watch him.
Mychael, as we get closer to the primaries and we move through the year and into early next year, we're going to start having some hearings for these prosecutions, these legal troubles that former President Trump is facing. Even in Georgia, there are going to be cameras in the courtroom. Do you think that Democrats are at all going to amp up their attacks on Trump having to do with these prosecutions these legal troubles, when we get closer to these hearing dates and we see it ramp up? And I would ask you, from the Democratic side, do you also think that it's really not going to chip away at former President Trump's support?
So I would advise every Democrat to literally respond to reporters by saying, have you asked Republicans what their stance is today? Because at the end of the day, Democrats should be quiet on this. Make Republicans defend this. The bad thing about Trump for Republicans isn't just that he's going to cost them the White House. It's what he's going to do down ticket. It's why I'm actually surprised that you think that Vivek had such a great night. The last debate, he said climate change wasn't real. This debate, he said that being transgender is a mental illness. Well, 30 years ago, we would call being gay a mental illness. That's not the future of the Republican Party.
He said in children, under 18, he was talking about the youth of this country. And
being a minor, I don't think is the difference between mental illness and not mental illness. But my broader point is Republicans need to bring people into the fold, not push people out. And Trump is not winning independents. He's not winning college-educated women anymore. I don't know how he is going to manage in a general election to pull all those voters back in.
So, but what we're finding in ours is the women-to-women polling, they don't like either candidate. Like, we can talk about how bad Trump is and his indictments, but look what's going on with Biden's family. Look what's going on with the senator from New Jersey. I mean, neither side is free of very questionable activities. And I think that helps the Republicans, like, okay, what side do we go with here? And I think it's going to be a tough choice next year if it is Biden and if it is Trump. I mean, and if the senator from New Jersey is still there, the man should resign.
The difference between Democrats and Republicans, Democrats have called on him to resign.
But he's not doing it, and they've not forced him out. And they certainly did that a few years ago. They were able to force him out. The leader needs to push him out. I mean, this is
one Menendez. I'm no defender of Menendez, but he was not pushed out. He got reelected.
Al Franklin was pushed out.
I'm going to jump in here because I want to get
him out. They made it very difficult for him. This is the second time the senator.
We're going to have some more. We're going to have some more time to go through all these topics, especially the debate, former President Trump's response, the response from President Biden, which is what I want to get to right now. The Biden campaign deployed several top officials to the debate tonight, including California Governor Gavin Newsom. Here to discuss more of the Biden administration's response to tonight's presidential primary debate is White House correspondent for The Hill, Alex Gangitano. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. What I wanted to ask you first is, how was the Biden campaign responding to tonight's debate? I saw some tweets coming from the president's Twitter account or X account. Tell us what the campaign was deploying tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Michael. So there was a lot of tweets and statements coming out of the Biden campaign pushing back on just generally what Republicans were saying and defending their own record. So first off, they were definitely very quick to push back on remarks about the economy and Republicans, saying that the economy didn't improve under President Biden. He's actually hurting Americans. And the Biden campaign did that by using this term Maganomics, which we saw them roll out as kind of a way to compare to Bidenomics, which is the president's economic agenda, and basically saying that under Maganomics, the working class families, middle class families are left behind. And there's tax cuts for the super rich and corporations, et cetera. We also saw a lot of them pushing back on immigration conversations during the debate, basically saying that Republican policies are cruel and inhumane. And crime, we saw them hit Biden on that. Meanwhile, the Biden campaign came back and said Republicans really have no plan on crime. This is all just lip service. An interesting one was on abortion when Ron DeSantis came out and said this wasn't a losing issue for Republicans in 2022 in states like Florida. The Biden campaign came out and said, you know what, it was a losing issue for Republicans in 2024, and it's going to be one again in 2022, and it's going to be one again in 2024. So they were quick to the punch with a lot of these hot topics and just defending a lot of the president's record.
So a strong rapid response is interesting, but sometimes it all comes down to the numbers. And we want to go over some recent poll numbers. An NBC News survey released this week ahead of the debate found that President Biden's disapproval reached a new high. 56% say they are unhappy with the job he's doing. Only 41% approve. So how do you think that the Biden campaign plans to course correct on this? I know that his poll numbers have been pretty low the past year and that the administration and the campaign has been brushing it off. But I mean, we're getting closer to those first caucuses when voters are going to be weighing in. How do they go about this?
Yeah, their strategy has pretty much been consistent throughout these really poor polling numbers that the president has had, which is he's always made a comeback. Just watch him defy the odds once again. They revert back to in 2020 when nobody thought he would win the Democratic nomination, and here he is as president. That, of course, though, is kind of a stale argument when again and again he's seeing these poor polling numbers. Another argument that you hear from outside of the campaign, just talking to surrogates and allies on the ground, is that the American voters aren't understanding yet the real impacts of Biden policies, and that once those are pushed out, once people are seeing funding for bridges in their towns from the infrastructure law or lower healthcare prices from the Inflation Reduction Act, then people will really understand. Well, that's up to the campaign to try to make that very clear to people what Biden policies have been able to do for individuals. And so they really have an uphill battle on trying to figure that out. And then a huge issue for the president in terms of his polling issue is, of course, his age. People see the fact that he's 80 years old, he'd be 86 at the end of his second term, as a problem. And we've seen polling show that people think that the president's age versus former President Trump, who is only a few years younger than him, is a bigger issue. So that's a battle that he's going to have to keep fighting and try to prove to people that he's up for the job regardless of his age.
There was one more stat in that NBC poll I wanted to talk to you about. Really fascinating. This has been President Biden in a direct matchup with former President Trump. They're tied at 46. President Biden would have a 1 percentage point edge over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. But this poll actually has Biden losing by 5 percentage points to Nikki Haley. Is the Biden campaign aware of, in these sort of polls, who could be his most formidable opponent and who poses the largest risk to him? Despite right now the GOP primary polls being so lopsided for former President Trump, it seems like the actual threat to the campaign is Nikki Haley.
That's right. That's a really good question, Michael, because so much of what the Biden campaign appears to be focused on is fighting back against former President Trump. If you read these statements and looked at, the way that they were both in Michigan fighting for support from the auto workers during the strike, it looks like a rematch of 2020. But somebody like Nikki Haley, who knows her stuff on foreign policy, she does well on the debate stage. She's had experiences in multiple different fields in government. And that's what people liked about President Biden when he was running, that experience and the fact that he, had this new vision versus former President Trump about foreign policy and about issues on how to deal with domestic policy too. And people, I think, can see them as these candidates who can go up against each other if you take, Trump and DeSantis out of the picture. But it's definitely interesting when I've talked to people about if Haley is considered as much of a threat as Trump is, just based on the fact that they really just talk about Trump. And it seems like the Biden campaign is not seeing her as that kind of threat. And they're just looking at, like you mentioned, the Republican candidates polling numbers among themselves and not the way that they poll against Biden. An interesting one is DeSantis, because the White House has pushed back on, policies in Florida that, of course, Ron DeSantis has spearheaded or signed a lot on these education standards in Florida, not so much as pushing back on him as a candidate because it's coming out of the White House, but pushing back on him as a governor. And we've seen a lot of that come directly from Vice President Harris going down to Florida and saying these education standards are wrong about how you teach slavery in the state and issues like that. So they have a bit of a focus on DeSantis, but I think Haley is the one that's been interesting to watch. A little lack of a focus on her, and if we'll see that creep up, especially after this last debate.
It's really fascinating because, like you said, it seems like the Biden campaign feels like it's already in a 1v1 matchup against former President Trump. Democrats have made Ron DeSantis their boogeyman when you talk about those Florida policies. But it seems like Nikki Haley is the one that poses the largest threat right there. There's one more stat I wanted to mention, just mentioning the 41 approval again and the 56 disapproval. Really quickly, I want to just look ahead to tomorrow, something that could chip away at that approval rating potentially. Tomorrow up on Capitol Hill, we're going to see the first hearing in the impeachment inquiry into President Biden. I know this is something that you and I have both been covering for The Hill very closely. Again, really quickly, we're running out of time here. How does the Biden campaign and the White House at large plan on responding to tomorrow's hearing and just in terms of the general impeachment response overall?
Yeah, so since impeachment has been floated back, over the summer, the White House has been really defensive, coming out with memos and statements for the media. Actually, they called the media out, saying that you need to do more on pushing back on lies out of what they said were lies out of what Republicans are saying. So they've been really bullish on this. And I think we're going to see that even stepped up as these hearings go on, that they're going to come out and say these are baseless attacks. Here's what actually happened. Here's why these are false lies that Republicans are peddling. And a big thing that they keep saying is that there's no evidence here to go towards the Republican claims, and they're moving forward without evidence. So it's been definitely a lot of influx towards reporters on what the White House thinks about this, and I think we expect a lot more out of them.
All right, Alex Cangitano, White House correspondent for The Hill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, back to the debate. Culture wars, personal values, what's being taught in schools. These hot-button issues were front and center on the debate stage tonight. A recent poll analyzed how voters feel about these issues heading into the 2024 presidential election. The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack, has more.
A recent poll by Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service finds that a majority, 7 in 10 voters, believe their personal values are under attack. When we look at the numbers along party lines, there certainly is a partisan divide. Republicans are much more likely to believe their personal values are under attack than Democrats or independents. Joining me now to dig deeper into these findings is Mo Alifi. He's the executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service. He's also the former chief spokesman of the Democratic National Committee during the Obama administration. Mo, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, what were your takeaways from this? And let me just ask you, why do you do this type of poll?
Yeah, we started tracking this back in 2019. And the poll is conducted by a bipartisan group of pollsters, Republican Ed Goaz, Democrat Celinda Lake. And the idea is to get a sense of how voters view the issue of polarization in our politics today. How bad do they think it is? Who do they blame? Is there a way out of it? And, you know, we've seen that since 2019, some of these numbers have been remarkably static. People are very frustrated with the state of our politics. They're very frustrated with the amount of polarization, but they send mixed signals sometimes on how to get out of it. One of the things, as you pointed out in your opening, that really struck us in this poll is just how many people, 7 in 10 Americans, a majority of every partisan stripe, believe that their personal values are under attack. And it makes sense when you think that your personal values are under attack, you sort of get your back up, it ruffles your feathers, and you become a little bit more combative. And I think that helps explain some of the level of polarization amongst the population, not just in Washington, but amongst the population. Everybody feels that they're under attack. And if you feel like you're under attack, you tend to have a villain, and that's playing out in our politics.
Well, speaking under attack, you have some fascinating numbers on civil war in this country. What did you find there?
We asked people to rate the level of political division in this country right now on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being no division at all, 100 being edge of civil war. And in this most recent poll, the mean response was 73. That means a majority of the country believes we are nearly 3/4 of the way to civil war. It's one of the highest ratings we've seen since we started tracking. Maybe one of the few times we've seen it higher was when we tracked this in the middle of, or right after the 2021 insurrection, January 6th. That's remarkably pessimistic. We then ask people how they think it'll look a year from now, and the number ticks up even slightly higher, 73.6. So people are very pessimistic about the level of polarization in our country.
Another topic I wanted to touch upon is education. And Mo, as you know, used to be, there are some topics that have been broadly bipartisan, whether that's transportation, certainly education. But in your poll findings, politicians trying to control what is being taught in school, 88% said yes. This is a bipartisan thing. I can see why both sides say this, but what's your take on this? That's such a high number.
Yeah, we wanted to test. This is such a big issue out on the campaign trail right now. And so we wanted to ask people, how bad do you think the problem is of politicians inserting their personal or their ideology into what's being taught in the classrooms? And as you saw there, overwhelmingly, people believe that's near as close to universal as you can get in a poll these days. That means Democrats think it's a problem, Republicans think it's a problem. But what's really clear and concerning is that they both think it's the other party that's doing it. Democratic voters think that what you're seeing down in Florida with Ron DeSantis and the Don't Say Gay bill is an example of this. Republicans think that it's critical race theory that's being imposed by the left into our classrooms. So again, this is one of those things where everybody sees a problem. They just think the other side is responsible for it.
Your poll also asked if woke culture is a serious problem. 56% agreed, 37% disagreed, 7% were unsure. Now, some people, obviously, some conservatives had trouble defining woke, which is generally speaking viewed as kind of liberal ideology. What was your take on these numbers? A little higher than I thought, maybe.
Yeah, a little higher, but not as high as the other question about ideology in the schools. And when you drill down on that question about woke, you do see a pretty strong partisan divide, with Republicans believing it is a huge problem, Democrats believing it is not that big of a problem at all, and independents a little bit more split, though leaning towards agreeing it's a problem. So Republicans are getting a lot of traction, which would explain why you hear so much of it in the middle of the Republican primary, and Democrats are pushing back on it because Democratic voters just aren't there. But if you look at those two questions together, that one and the one about schools, you can see how Democrats are trying to flip the issue of wokeism on its head by saying it's actually the Republicans who are inserting themselves in, and not the left.
You know, I like to be an optimist, but when you look at some of these poll numbers, this one and other polls, it's hard to be, because so many presidents in the past have promised to unite the country. Certainly, George W. Bush did it. Obama had very high ratings. It was 70%. I don't know if we'll ever see 70% approval rating for a president again. And then Trump, of course, and Biden. But we're still so polarized. I'm just trying to end this interview on an upbeat note. Where's the hope? What is the solution? Maybe not until after the next election in 2024, but do you think there's a time when people are going to say enough is enough with this polarization?
Yeah, look, I think the key is for our political leaders to be out there talking about where our shared values are. And right now, the incentive structure is not there. And let me give you a couple more numbers to explain why. When you ask people to choose between a politician who consistently fights for my values, even if it means not finding a solution, versus a politician who is willing to work together to get things done, even if it means compromising on my values sometimes, the compromising politician wins by a margin of 2-1, 67 to 31%. But even then, it gets confusing because voters are confused to some extent what they want. When you ask them this question slightly differently, agree or disagree, compromise and common ground are noble goals we want our leaders to aspire to. 83% say they agree with that. Literally the next question. I am tired of leaders who compromise on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. 82% say they agree with that. It's as if voters are saying, sure, I want common ground. Just come to where I'm standing, and then we'll be on common ground. That's a tough line for political leaders to walk. But if they're out there making the case about our shared values, where we agree, even if we're going to disagree on policy, but talk from a values perspective about where we agree, then I think we can start to reconcile a little bit. We're always going to be polarized, but maybe we'll see some of the, maybe we can detoxify the air a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Compromise is not a bad word, but it's treated as such all the time in politics, as you know. Mo Alithi, thank you so much for joining us. Very sharp analysis, as usual.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Bob. Foreign policy has continued to take center stage, both in this presidential election on Capitol Hill, but especially in this debate. Let's take a listen to some of the exchanges during the Fox Business Network's debate tonight when it comes to foreign policy.
Fact that our national vital interest is in degrading the Russian military.
The Chinese are paying for the Russian war in Ukraine. The Iranians are supplying more sophisticated weapons, and so are the North Koreans now as well.
Joining me now to discuss how the candidates did on this topic is former Trump State Department spokesperson and founder of Polaris National Security, Morgan Ortagus. Morgan, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Sure. So I wanted to start off by this conversation about Ukraine. It got really fascinating on the debate stage. This has been an issue that's fractured Republicans at large, you know, on Capitol Hill within the House Republican Conference particularly, and then as we're seeing on the debate stage. So break it down for us. What did you take away from this conversation? We had someone like Ron DeSantis saying he doesn't want a blank check for Ukraine, other candidates saying that funding for Kyiv should continue. What did you make of this conversation about Ukraine?
It's sort of a continuation of the conversation that they're having on Capitol Hill, as you referenced, as the Congress tries to figure out how we're going to get this various spending packages through and actually fund the government or, God forbid, face another government shutdown. So I think it's a continuation of the debate that on within the party. And I don't think it's necessarily as cut and dry as some analysts make it out to be. There are certainly impassioned parts of the party that want zero funding for Ukraine at all. And then you have people on the other spectrum, as you saw the clips that you showed. Chris Christie gave a strong defense. Nikki Haley gave a strong defense. Pence has in the past debate for why it's important to to see Russia defeated for their war against the Ukrainians. I think what the candidates missed the opportunity to do tonight, however, is to remind the American people of why we're in this precarious position in the first place. And there are actually many actions taken by President Biden and his administration leading up to the invasion in Ukraine, which is why we saw it happen, which is why we saw the failed deterrence policy from the Biden administration that led to Putin invading. And it's important I think, for the candidates to understand and discuss and explain to the American people why the Biden administration failed at deterrence, why Europe is in war right now. Because if we don't learn those failed deterrence lessons in Ukraine, then we may miss them as it relates to China and Taiwan. And that's going to be much harder to deter Xi Jinping from a military invasion, some sort of military incursion over Taiwan. So I was happy to hear that there was a lot more discussion in tonight's debate about China than the last debate. I think it only had a few mentions. So the Ukraine debate is important, but even more important is to hear where the candidates are on China.
This topic of Ukraine, it seems to be putting a divide throughout the Republican Party of you have the America First ideals when it comes to foreign policy, something that was really promoted by former President Trump. And then you have the conservative ideas, your institutional conservative ideas of allyship around the country, having NATO be a really central part of foreign policy. Do you see this divide being a real game changer for any voters within the Republican Party? Because again, we saw a lot of airtime about it. We're seeing this fight play out on center stage on Capitol Hill. This difference between Republicans when it comes to Ukraine and foreign policy at large, it's getting a lot of airtime in the political spectrum. I'm curious to know if you think it's a real game changer with voters.
I don't know that voters, if you look at the top list of polling that are put out by mainstream media organizations, Ukraine and Russia is not normally on any top 10 list that I've seen. People are much more concerned about inflation. You have families around America that are making really hard decisions about whether they fill up their gas tank in their car, whether they fill it up all the way, or whether they go into the grocery store and fill up their cart with groceries. These are real choices that Americans have to make as we continue to see food inflation and as we unfortunately continue to see gas prices go up around this country. So I think, and this is typical with politics in general, foreign policy, the stuff that I work in doesn't necessarily move elections. But I will tell you the one foreign policy thing that we have seen move Biden's numbers and potentially could have an impact in 2024 is the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, the disastrous withdrawal that led to 13 young men and women, American service members, losing their lives unnecessarily. That's the one foreign policy thing that I've really seen stick. And I would encourage the Republican candidates, instead of battling with each other over Ukraine, bring the focus of the American people back onto the failed deterrent strategy of the Biden administration that led to the worst war on Europe's soil that we've seen since World War II. And that's on Biden's watch.
Another topic that we saw take center stage tonight, a lot of airtime, was immigration, of course, which for a long time has been a key interest and a key priority of Republicans. It also comes at an interesting time as we're seeing border security take center stage in government funding negotiations up on Capitol Hill. So on the debate stage tonight, all the candidates essentially said they support a border on a wall on the southern border. There was a lot of discussion about fentanyl. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on how the conversation about immigration will resonate with voters, especially, particularly Republican voters, and how these candidates can differentiate themselves from each other when it comes to this really important issue to Republican voters of immigration.
Well, you stole the word out of my head. I was thinking to myself, how do you differentiate yourself on that primary debate stage whenever actually most of the candidates are in agreement? What's interesting to me is that it's not just the Republican candidates, right? You can look no farther than the mayor of New York City to Democratic politicians on the border, members of Congress, mayors, others that are pleading with this administration, with their own Democratic administration, and saying, listen, these border policies do not work. They are not good for our communities. I even hesitate to call them border policies because I don't really see what the policy is. We have an undefended border. We're getting close to almost 300 terrorists, people who are on the terror watch list, who have crossed over. And these, of course, are just the terrorists that are dumb enough to get caught. We don't know. There's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that we can't even account for. And I think what's really important, and several of the candidates did this tonight, is they really focused on fentanyl. Because if you get out into regular American communities, like the people who are watching our show right now, everybody knows a family that has been affected by fentanyl. We know that the chemical precursors come from China. We have not seen any policy actions to actually stop that from happening from China. We saw the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, go to China a few months ago, and he got them to agree to a working group on fentanyl. Well, I don't think for the average parents around this country who have seen a child in the neighborhood or at the school die from fentanyl, a working group on China just isn't enough for them. And I think it was really smart that the candidates focused on that part of the border, because it's not just the fact that it's an undefended border with people on the terror watch list coming over. It's the fact that we have porous borders through our ports of entry, really just, an epidemic of fentanyl that's killing young people 18 to 49 more than anything else in this country right now.
Morgan Ortagus, I could have gone much longer with you. There was a lot of foreign policy in the conversation tonight, but we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks. It's good to be on.
All right, next up is The Hill's national politics reporter, Julia Manchester. She's in California for the debate tonight. She joins us now with News Nation contributor Johanna Mosca, who served as President Obama's White House Director of Press Advance.
We're outside the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library here in Simi Valley, California, where the Republican presidential primary debate, the second one, just wrapped up. I'm here with News Nation's Johanna Mosca. Thank you so much for joining us,
Great
Johanna.
to be here. What a lovely debate it was. It was a lot of popcorn consumed.
A lot of popcorn moments.
Absolutely. Really tense moments.
Definitely. And I mean, I guess, what was your standout moment, and who was your standout candidate watching this?
So Nikki Haley needed to perform at this debate, and she did. She came with facts. She talked about things in a different way than any of her other colleagues did. She talked about education reform in a holistic way, in which she was talking about not just charter schools. She's talking about the reform that has to happen from vocational education to every school that exists for our kids. She talked about health care in a different way. She talked about bringing transparency to a system, whereas other candidates were, again, just saying, we're going to throw Obamacare in the trash. She actually talked about policies in a different way, where I thought, I want to hear more, and if that's what Republican voters hear, they'll come to her events. So she absolutely stood out. Tim Scott actually got in this debate. He didn't get in the last one, but this one he did. He started by going after Vivek Ramaswamy, which we talked about on the Hill earlier today. I said I thought that the candidates would still go after Vivek because he has no experience, and indeed I was right. They did. They went hard at him for all of the foreign investment that his companies have taken, and he has admitted, he had money from the Saudis, he's had money from all these entities that now he's talking about. So Tim Scott went after him because, of course, he had accused of the other candidates of being bought and paid for. Tim Scott was a small business owner before he was in the Senate. So I think he took offense to that, and he came out he came out strong. He also talked about, slavery in a different way, really being clear with GOP voters that there is no silver lining to slavery when this debate has been led by DeSantis. DeSantis did not have the night that he needed. There were a couple moments in which he tried to kind of tossle back and forth, but it was, a little weak, I think, both on policies and when he tried to come at different candidates. It was it wasn't perceived as like very substantive. And poor Pence got moved to the suburbs tonight. He was all the way out there. Yeah. And I'm afraid he didn't have any big breakthrough moments, though he did say that in 2018 when Vivek was pulling out of his Chinese entanglements was probably when he was deciding to vote for the first time, and that was very funny.
And going back to DeSantis, though, I mean, it took him 16 minutes to speak in this debate. He was center stage here. I mean, what does that tell you?
That was. And, jumping in for the candidates didn't help them all, right? Because Doug Burgum jumped in, and then when there were topics that were topics he could speak to, the moderators were like, no, thank you. So, DeSantis didn't take it that way. But also, toward the end, when he was asked to just answer the question of who would you vote off the island, which is truly the question. If any of them want to win against Donald Trump, they got to vote a lot of people off the island. He refused to answer it. And I think every time he does this, it ends up being a food fight. People pile on. He's not standing out.
And do you think Donald Trump, in a way, could have been seen as a winner of this debate? I mean, he's literally the elephant in the room, and he's also doing counter-programming tonight.
He's the elephant in the room. But look, there is a voter out there that wants an alternative to Donald Trump in the Republican constituency. And you're starting to see one emerge. It's Nikki Haley. If you want a candidate who has come to 2 debates now and brought more substance than her other candidates, if you want to say who would Democrats be afraid of on that stage, it would be Nikki Haley. They would not be as afraid of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump rehashed the same stuff in Michigan, now with a record in which actually he didn't bring jobs to Michigan. He lost plants in Michigan. So Democrats can run against that easy. Nikki Haley, if the one thing they've got against her is that she allowed the pre-measured and pre-bought curtains to go in to the UN headquarters, the U.S. UN residency, then that's kind of pulling for straws.
Yeah, and final question, how much does this debate ultimately matter in the grand scheme of things?
It does matter, and people underestimate these. The people that care, the people who are going to show up, they're watching. And so, for pundits to say Donald Trump has this in the bag just because of polls, people vote. People in states vote, and they still have the right to vote. Many people in many states. Now, the Republican Party is making it more difficult in some states, including making caucuses instead of primaries, and we'll find out in October how difficult they're going to make it for people to vote, but they haven't voted yet. And so if the Republican Party allows a fair contest, it is still anybody's game, and I think Nikki Haley had the performance that she needed to keep going.
Yeah, and we're seeing her starting to rise in some of these early state primary polls, including New Hampshire. So, Johanna, thank you so much for all of your insight. Back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks, Julia. And now back with me for some final thoughts, our Democratic strategist and founding partner of Northern Star Strategies, Mychael Starr Hopkins, and Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership and founder of the Women to Women Conversations Tour. So guys, you listened to all that. There was a lot to cover tonight. As I mentioned at the top, a lot of policy discussion, a lot of personal attacks. I want to know your parting thoughts. And of course, the million-dollar question here, did this debate tonight sway any voters? You heard Johanna right there say that these debates still matter, but at the end of the day, do you think that they swayed anyone? Sarah, it's your party. We'll go to you first.
Unfortunately, I don't think they did sway anyone. I think that only a few people actually watch these. We are still with Trump. I mean, there's no question about that. Something big is going to happen to change that. I will agree, though, that Nikki Haley, she did have a good debate as well as Vivek, as I said earlier. But I don't know what's going to break the Trump stronghold. And these debates, I just don't think are going to do it.
Mychael, you think any voters tonight switched their column from one candidate to another?
So I actually don't think there's such a thing as an undecided voter anymore. I think either you're with Trump or you're not going to show up to the polls. I think either you're with Biden or you're just tuned out of this. Like, if you're going to vote, you know who you're going to vote for at this point. And so I think for Democrats and Republicans, this is going to be about turnout. How do you get your voters out? How do you keep them energized and active?
And now, this was only the second GOP primary debate. There are more to come. From last debate to this debate, we saw the debate stage dwindle a little bit. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson was not on stage tonight. As a final question to you both, do you think that we will see the debate stage shrink a little bit more before the next debate?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think it's time for the two on the ends to step away. I hate to say that about former vice president, but it's time to narrow the field. I think if you really want to go at Trump and try to defeat him, we need to go head to head with him.
Mychael, how about you?
I mean, the smart thing would be for them to call the field, but I don't really see any reason for the campaigns to do it at this point. I mean, these are auditions for Fox News, for book deals. I mean, the longer they stay in, the more money they can make. And so, if they really cared about democracy, then yeah, I think they'd get out. But I think it's a vanity campaign at this point. We saw with Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar on the Democrat side, they got out of the race to make sure that everyone got behind Biden so they could beat Trump. I think Republicans at this point are on a suicide pact.
And I was just told from the control room that I got the timing messed up. We have time for some more questions, which I'm happy about because there's much more to get to. An exchange I wanted to touch on was about TikTok, and it was between Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. And essentially, it got into the conversation of Nikki Haley saying, well, TikTok is a very dangerous platform. You're playing into China. Vivek Ramaswamy saying that he uses TikTok because if you want to win elections, you have to get in touch with those younger voters. I'm curious to know what you guys thought of those competing thoughts. Nikki Haley being very hawkish on China, which is, of course, something that we see frequently in the Republican Party. But Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the younger candidates on stage, saying, hey, look, if we want to speak to the whole electorate, we have to use some different strategies. Sarah, we'll go to you first.
So I actually think both of them are right. TikTok is very bad. It should not be available in this country. However, it is. And as much as I hate it, my friends and our children are on TikTok. I mean, they don't even understand what the problem is. They love it. It is probably the go-to for everybody from 50 on down. So we as a country have not explained the problem with TikTok well enough to the American people. So in a way, Vivek is right. That's where you reach the majority of the people.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that back and forth said more about Nikki Haley and her relationship to Vivek than it did about what they were actually talking about. I think there's a level of contempt there. I mean, she has spent her entire life, she's governor, she was a U.S. senator, then, went up to the UN. And you have Vivek, who, this guy in his 30s, who thinks he knows everything, that lectures everyone in the field. I just think there's this level of her being annoyed. And I will not pretend to speak for women, but I think that a lot of women understood the look on her face when she made the comment about being sick and tired of him.
And now we have some breaking news just in terms of the next debate looking forward in this GOP primary. Former President Trump's campaign confirms to our partners at News Nation that the former president will not take part in the third presidential debate. That will be in Miami. He's going to sit that one out as well. I know we spoke about at the top of the show whether or not it was smart or not smart for Trump to sit out today's debate, but here he is right now saying he's again going to skip the debate stage for a third time. Curious to know what your thoughts are on that, especially, again, as we get closer to the primaries, as this debate stage starts to dwindle a little bit. It seems like he's running ahead with this strategy. Sarah, I know at the top you said it's a smart way to do it. Do you think it is even for the subsequent and subsequent debates to come?
I still think it is. As I said earlier, he's up 40 points over most of the people on that stage. Now, if somebody catches fire after tonight and actually can start to really compete with him, then I think you're going to see a different former President Trump. But in the meantime, why? Why go on the stage and get attacked by all the other candidates? He's up 40 points. He can sit there, he can smile, he can watch it on TV.
And Michael, I want to get to you quickly on this topic, and then we have to wrap it up. Right now, if the polls stay how they are, and if those are how the results are, we're going to be seeing another Biden versus Trump matchup for 2024. If President Trump continues on this trajectory, I guess it's within the realm of possibility that he doesn't debate President Biden for the general. Do you want to see if former President Trump is the GOP nominee, if President Biden, as expected, glides to the Democratic nomination? Do you want to see the two debate?
Look, I think it's healthy in a democracy for both parties to put up candidates and debate each other in front of the American public. But Donald Trump has made a joke out of presidential debates. And honestly, it's become a source of misinformation. So I don't think we would miss anything by not having a debate. But I think it shows how broken the norms have become, that we're discussing whether or not we'll even have presidential debates. And I think that's something that the American public doesn't want to go back to. The chaos, the breaking of norms. I just think people are tired of it. And whether they like Joe Biden or don't like Joe Biden, they know that they don't want the Trump years back.
All right, we'll have to leave the conversation there. Sarah, Michael, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. There was a lot to unpack. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And that'll do it tonight for us here at The Hill. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. You can rewatch any of our interviews on thehill.com, YouTube, and anywhere you stream your news. And of course, don't forget to tune in to Rising starting at 11 a.m. Brianna Joy Gray and Amber Athey will have their reaction to tonight's debate. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great night.